You're really wearing that. My husband Thomas Hayes said those words while standing in the doorway of our bedroom, adjusting the cuff of his expensive navy suit as if my presence in the room required correction. I had just finished pinning the small silver clasp on the simple blue dress I'd owned for nearly 10 years, the same dress I wore to church on Easter and to my granddaughter's school recital last spring. It wasn't flashy, and it certainly didn't belong in the glossy magazine version of a corporate gala, but it was clean, pressed, and comfortable. At 68 years old, comfort mattered more to me than impressing strangers in a ballroom. Thomas, however, stared at me as though I had just committed some terrible social mistake. It's the company anniversary gala, Eleanor, he added with a thin smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. 500 people will be there. Executives, investors, people who expect a certain image. I looked at him quietly for a moment, smoothing the fabric of my dress over my hips. I thought the invitation said spouses were welcome, I replied. He sighed, the way someone does when they believe they're being patient with a child. They are, he said, stepping closer and lowering his voice. But there's a difference between being welcome and fitting in. That word lingered in the air between us. Fitting in. I had heard versions of it many times during our 41 years of marriage, though it had grown sharper over the last decade as Thomas climbed higher in his company. When we were younger, when he was just a junior analyst working long hours in a small office downtown, he used to say he admired how grounded I was. He said I reminded him of what mattered. Somewhere along the way, the things that once made me valuable to him began to make him uncomfortable. I picked up my small beige handbag from the dresser and slipped my reading glasses inside. The dress is fine, Thomas, I said gently. And besides, I'm not there to impress anyone. He chuckled softly, though it sounded more like a breath of disbelief than humor. That's exactly what I'm worried about, he muttered, grabbing his car keys from the nightstand. The drive to the Grand Lexington Hotel took about 20 minutes, though the silence inside the car made it feel longer. Through the window, I watched the city lights slide across the glass like reflections in water. Downtown was alive that night, glowing with polished restaurants and crowded sidewalks. When we pulled up to the entrance, a valet opened Thomas's door immediately. Men in black suits and women in glittering gowns stepped out of luxury cars like figures from another world. I suddenly understood what Thomas had meant about fitting in. My blue dress suddenly felt quieter than I had imagined, like a whisper in a room full of applause. Inside the ballroom, the ceiling lights sparkled like hundreds of tiny stars. White tablecloths covered dozens of round tables, and a jazz band played softly near the stage. Waiters carried silver trays of sparkling drinks across the room. Thomas immediately straightened his posture, the familiar corporate version of him appearing as if a switch had been flipped. He shook hands with two men near the entrance and laughed at something one of them said. I stood half a step behind him, smiling politely, waiting for him to introduce me. He didn't. After a moment, he leaned slightly toward me without looking directly at me. Why don't you sit over there for a bit? He said, nodding toward a small table near the far wall. I just need to greet a few people. I followed his gesture and saw the corner table, slightly removed from the crowd. For a brief second, I wondered if he realized what he was doing. But Thomas was already moving forward, his voice rising confidently as he greeted another executive. I walked slowly toward the corner table, my heels tapping softly against the polished floor. Around me, conversations blended into a gentle hum of business deals and polished laughter. I sat down, folded my hands in my lap, and watched the room from a distance. Across the ballroom, my husband moved easily through the crowd, smiling, shaking hands, belonging. And for the first time that evening, I realized something strange about the room full of important people. None of them were looking at me at all. I sat at the small corner table for several minutes, quietly observing the flow of people moving through the ballroom like a carefully choreographed dance. The band played a smooth jazz melody that floated gently through the air, while servers in black vests carried trays of sparkling water and delicate appetizers. Between clusters of executives, every table closer to the center of the room was filled with couples leaning toward each other in animated conversation, but my table remained empty except for me. I folded my hands together and watched Thomas across the room as he moved confidently from one conversation to the next. He laughed loudly at a joke one man told, placed a friendly hand on another man's shoulder, and nodded politely as a woman in a shimmering silver dress spoke to him. In that moment, he looked completely at home in that environment, like someone who had practiced for years to become part of a world that once seemed out of reach. A young server stopped beside my table and offered a tray of drinks. I thanked him and picked up a glass of sparkling water. The glass felt cool against my fingers as I took a small sip and glanced around the room again. After a few minutes, two women approached the table beside mine. They appeared to be in their late 30s, both wearing elegant evening gowns and the kind of confident expressions that suggested they attended events like this often. One of them glanced briefly at me before turning to her friend. "Is this table taken?" she asked while placing her purse on the chair. The other woman shrugged and looked at me again with polite curiosity. "Excuse me," she said, smiling politely. "Are you with the catering staff, or are you waiting for someone?" Her question was not cruel, but it carried the casual assumption that I did not belong in the same way the other guests did. I smiled gently and shook my head. "I am waiting for my husband," I said. "He works here." The two women exchanged a quick look that I could not quite interpret, then one of them nodded. "Oh, that makes sense," she replied before turning back to her friend and beginning a conversation about travel plans and upcoming conferences. Their voices blended into the background as I sat quietly, reflecting on how easily people decide where someone fits simply by looking at them. Across the ballroom, I saw Thomas speaking with a tall man wearing a black tuxedo and a bright red tie. The man appeared to be telling a long story while Thomas listened attentively, nodding and smiling at exactly the right moments. A few seconds later, Thomas laughed again and gestured toward the stage where a large banner displayed the company logo and the words celebrating 25 years of success. I noticed something else then. Several couples stood together near the stage taking photos. The husbands placed a hand gently on their wives' backs while photographers captured the moment. One man introduced his wife proudly to another group, and she waved politely while everyone smiled. I watched those moments quietly and realized that in the entire half hour since we arrived, Thomas had not once looked back toward the corner where I was sitting. It was not anger that I felt. It was something quieter than that, something more familiar. It was the quiet understanding that sometimes a person can share decades of life with someone and still discover that they occupy very different places in the same room. I adjusted the sleeve of my dress and took another small sip of water. At the center of the ballroom, a group of employees suddenly shifted their attention toward the entrance as if something important had just changed. Conversations softened, and the music seemed to fade slightly beneath the growing murmur of anticipation moving through the crowd. I followed their gaze toward the tall glass doors at the far end of the room, wondering who had just arrived that could quietly command the attention of hundreds of people without saying a single word. The quiet ripple of attention that moved across the ballroom slowly turned into a focused silence as the tall glass doors opened and a small group of people stepped inside. Even from the corner of the room, I could feel the shift in energy. Conversations softened, shoulders straightened, and people who had been casually chatting only moments earlier now turned their bodies toward the entrance with polite expectation. At the center of that small group was a man I recognized immediately from the framed photographs displayed in the company lobby earlier that evening. Alexander Grant, the chief executive officer of the entire corporation, walked into the room with the calm confidence of someone who had spent years becoming accustomed to being the most important person in every room he entered. He was taller than I had imagined, with silver hair neatly combed back and a dark suit that seemed perfectly tailored. He did not rush. Instead, he moved slowly through the entrance, while the people around him smiled and greeted him with respectful enthusiasm. Several executives stepped forward to shake his hand, including the tall man with the red tie who had been speaking with Thomas earlier. I noticed Thomas quickly adjust his jacket as he turned toward the entrance as well. His posture changed instantly, as if an invisible string had lifted his shoulders and pulled his chin slightly higher. I could almost hear the thoughts running through his mind from across the room. This was the moment he had been waiting for all evening, the opportunity to be seen and recognized by the leader of the company he had dedicated so many years to serving. A few feet away from him, another group of employees gathered in a neat semicircle as Alexander Grant greeted them one by one. His voice carried easily across the polished marble floor, warm and composed as he thanked them for their work and spoke briefly about the anniversary celebration. People laughed politely at his comments, and several phones appeared in the air as someone captured a quick photograph of the moment. Meanwhile, I remained seated at the same small corner table, watching the scene unfold like someone observing a distant stage performance. From where I sat, I could see the entire path leading from the entrance through the center of the ballroom. Alexander Grant began walking slowly in that direction, shaking hands occasionally while listening to the short introductions offered by the managers who accompanied him. Every few steps, someone new approached him with an eager smile. He greeted each person kindly, but he did not linger long. His attention moved steadily forward, scanning the room with the thoughtful expression of a man searching for something he had not yet found. I noticed Thomas gradually positioning himself closer to the center aisle where the chief executive officer was expected to pass. He timed his movements carefully, finishing one conversation and stepping casually toward another group until he stood only a few feet from the main walkway. When Alexander Grant reached that area, Thomas extended his hand with a confident smile and introduced himself. I could not hear every word from where I sat, but I saw the brief handshake and the polite nod that followed. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds before the chief executive officer continued walking. Thomas's smile lingered for a moment after the handshake ended, though there was a flicker of disappointment in his expression when the conversation did not last longer. The crowd gradually relaxed again as Alexander Grant continued across the ballroom, greeting a few more people while the music quietly resumed its gentle rhythm in the background. I took another sip of my water and looked toward the stage where the large company banner hung beneath the ceiling lights. The evening seemed to be moving along exactly as Thomas had hoped, filled with polite introductions and carefully measured opportunities. Then something unexpected happened. As Alexander Grant reached the far side of the ballroom, he suddenly slowed his steps. His eyes moved slowly across the tables as if he had just noticed something unusual in the distance. For a brief moment, his gaze settled directly in the direction of the quiet corner where I was sitting alone. I assumed he was simply scanning the room like any host greeting his guests, so I lowered my eyes toward the table. But when I looked up again a few seconds later, I realized something that made my fingers tighten slightly around the glass in my hand. The chief executive officer was no longer walking past my table. Instead, he had stopped completely and was looking straight at me. I felt a strange stillness settle around me as Alexander Grant remained standing several yards away, his eyes fixed in my direction with an expression that was not casual curiosity, but something more deliberate. At first, I assumed he must be looking past me at someone sitting behind my table, so I glanced slightly over my shoulder. But the chair behind me was empty, and the wall beyond it was lined only with soft golden lights reflecting off polished panels. When I turned back toward the room, I realized he had not moved. The conversation around him had slowed again, and several employees standing nearby followed his gaze with mild confusion, as if they were also trying to understand what had caught his attention. For a brief moment, I considered the possibility that I had done something inappropriate without realizing it. Perhaps I had accidentally sat at a table reserved for someone important or unknowingly stepped into an area meant only for staff earlier in the evening. But none of those explanations made sense. I had not moved from the chair Thomas suggested nearly 40 minutes earlier. Alexander Grant then took a single step forward, still looking directly at me. The executives walking beside him paused instinctively, as though uncertain whether they should continue following him or remain where they were. The room had not fallen completely silent, but the rhythm of the conversations had changed enough that people nearby were beginning to notice the unusual pause in his movement. I could feel a few curious glances drifting toward the corner table where I sat. Across the ballroom, I noticed Thomas turning his head slightly as well, his attention caught by the subtle shift in the room's focus. He looked toward the chief executive officer first, and then slowly traced the direction of the man's gaze until his eyes landed on me. I saw the brief moment of confusion on his face before he quickly looked back toward the center of the room, perhaps assuming the chief executive officer would soon move on to greet someone more important. But Alexander Grant did not move on. Instead, he began walking in a straight line across the open floor, leaving the cluster of executives behind him. Each step seemed unhurried yet purposeful, the kind of movement that naturally draws attention without needing to demand it. Several conversations around the ballroom faded as people quietly noticed the direction he was heading. From where I sat, I could feel the growing curiosity spreading through the nearby tables. The two women who had spoken with me earlier also looked up from their conversation, and followed the path of the approaching figure with raised eyebrows. One of them whispered something to the other while glancing briefly at me again, as if trying to determine whether I had somehow been expecting this. My first instinct was to stand politely out of respect as he approached, but my legs felt oddly heavy for a moment as I tried to understand why the most important person in the entire company would be walking toward a quiet corner table where an older woman sat alone with a glass of water. When he was about 10 feet away, I finally rose from my chair. The soft music from the band continued playing, but the space around us had grown noticeably quieter. Alexander Grant slowed his steps as he reached the edge of the table and studied my face carefully, not with the distant politeness of a businessman greeting a stranger, but with the focused attention of someone searching his memory for a familiar detail. I felt a sudden flicker of recognition in his eyes, the kind that appears when a long-forgotten name finally returns to someone's mind. He smiled gently then, and for a brief moment his expression carried a warmth that seemed completely separate from the formal atmosphere of the corporate celebration surrounding us. People at the nearby tables had now turned fully in their chairs, openly watching the unexpected encounter unfolding in the corner of the ballroom. Even across the room, I could see Thomas staring toward us with a puzzled expression that slowly shifted toward concern. Alexander Grant extended his hand politely, but before I could speak, he said something in a calm voice that carried just far enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Excuse me," he said, looking directly at me with unmistakable certainty in his eyes, "but I believe I have been trying to find you for a very long time." For a moment, I simply looked at the man standing in front of me, trying to understand the meaning behind his words. The chief executive officer of the entire company was standing beside a quiet corner table speaking to me as if we were old acquaintances, and yet his face, though familiar from company photographs, was not someone I had personally known. His hand remained extended politely, and after a brief pause I placed my hand in his. His handshake was warm and respectful, not hurried or distracted like many of the greetings exchanged throughout the evening. "I am sorry," I said gently, meeting his eyes with a polite smile. "I am not sure we have met before." The faintest hint of amusement appeared in his expression, the kind that suggested he had expected that answer. Around us, several nearby guests had fully turned their chairs now, openly watching the conversation. I could hear the soft rustle of evening gowns and the quiet shifting of chairs as people leaned closer in curiosity. Alexander Grant nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his memory. "That does not surprise me," he replied calmly. "It has been many years, and at the time I doubt you realized how much your help meant." I felt a small flicker of confusion at his words. "Help?" I searched my memory quickly, but could not recall a situation where I had assisted someone who later became the leader of a major corporation. Across the ballroom, I noticed Thomas beginning to walk toward us with careful steps, his expression tight with uncertainty. He seemed unsure whether he should approach or remain where he was. The executives who had been walking with Alexander Grant earlier now stood several yards away, quietly observing the exchange with the same puzzled curiosity as everyone else. The chief executive officer released my hand and studied my face again for a moment, as though confirming a detail he had been carrying in his mind for a very long time. "You are Eleanor Hayes," he said with quiet confidence. Hearing my name spoken so clearly caught me by surprise. "Yes," I replied slowly. A warm smile spread across his face then, one that seemed far more personal than the polite greetings he had offered to the other guests earlier. "I thought so," he said softly. "You probably do not remember the day, but I remember it very clearly." I felt the attention of the entire nearby section of the ballroom resting on us now. The two women at the neighboring table were watching with wide eyes, and even the servers moving between tables had slowed their steps. Alexander Grant rested one hand lightly on the back of the empty chair beside me as he spoke. "About 20 years ago," he continued, "I was a young man trying to keep a small technology company alive in a rented office above a bookstore on Franklin Street. We had 5 employees, very little funding, and a long list of people telling us that our idea would never succeed." His voice carried the steady tone of someone recalling a moment that had shaped the direction of his life. As he spoke, I felt a faint stirring in my memory, like the first page of an old photograph album beginning to open. Franklin Street, a small office above a bookstore. It was a place I had visited once many years ago while helping a friend review financial plans for a group of struggling entrepreneurs. At the time, it had seemed like nothing more than a small favor on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. Alexander Grant continued speaking, unaware that the memory was slowly returning to me. That afternoon, a woman walked into our office and spent nearly 2 hours reviewing our business proposal, he said. She asked questions that none of the banks had bothered to ask. She pointed out a mistake in our financial projections that would have destroyed the company within 6 months. And before she left, she gave us one piece of advice that changed everything. He paused for a moment then, his eyes meeting mine again with unmistakable recognition. The woman who gave that advice, he said quietly, was you. I felt the memory settle more clearly into place as Alexander Grant spoke, like a photograph slowly sharpening after years of being tucked away in a drawer. 20 years earlier, I had indeed visited a small office above a bookstore on Franklin Street. At the time, I had not gone there because I believed I was about to influence the future of a major company. I had simply agreed to accompany an old colleague who occasionally asked me to review financial plans for young entrepreneurs who could not yet afford professional consultants. I remembered the narrow staircase that led up from the bookstore, the faint smell of paper and coffee drifting through the hallway, and the cramped office with mismatched chairs gathered around a scratched wooden table. 5 young people had been sitting there that afternoon with a mixture of excitement and quiet desperation on their faces. They had built a promising idea, but their financial projections had serious weaknesses that none of them seemed to fully understand yet. I had spent nearly 2 hours going through their documents line by line, asking questions and pointing out problems that could eventually destroy the entire operation if they were ignored. When Alexander Grant mentioned the mistake in their projections, I could clearly remember the exact moment now. Their expansion plan assumed that revenue would double within a single year without accounting for the cost of scaling their infrastructure. I had gently explained that if they moved forward with that assumption, they would run out of operating capital within 6 months. I had also suggested a slower growth model and advised them to focus on building a stable client base before pursuing aggressive expansion. It had been simple advice, nothing extraordinary, the kind of guidance any careful financial planner might have offered. Yet standing there in the bright ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel, listening to the chief executive officer describe that afternoon as if it were a turning point in his life, I suddenly realized that the quiet conversation in that small office had mattered far more than I had ever imagined. Around us, the nearby guests were listening with open curiosity. I could hear faint murmurs spreading across the tables as people attempted to piece together the unexpected connection between the elderly woman sitting alone in the corner and the leader of the company hosting the celebration. Alexander Grant continued speaking, his voice calm but filled with sincere appreciation. He explained that after I left their office that day, the small team had completely rewritten their financial strategy using the framework I had suggested. They slowed their expansion, secured a modest but stable line of funding, and spent the next several years building a strong foundation before pursuing the ambitious growth that eventually transformed their startup into the corporation it had become today. While he spoke, I noticed Thomas finally approaching from across the ballroom, his steps measured and cautious. The expression on his face was difficult to read from a distance, but it was clear he was trying to understand why the chief executive officer of the entire company was standing beside the small table where his wife had been sitting alone all evening. When Thomas reached the edge of the group, he paused respectfully, waiting for an appropriate moment to speak. Alexander Grant glanced briefly in his direction and then returned his attention to me with the same thoughtful smile. "You probably thought it was a small favor," he said gently. "But that afternoon gave us the chance to survive long enough to become what we are today." I felt a quiet warmth rise in my chest, not because of the attention surrounding us, but because I had always believed that thoughtful advice, offered sincerely, could shape a person's path in ways that were impossible to measure at the time. I had simply never expected to hear that belief confirmed so publicly. Alexander Grant then gestured toward the large ballroom filled with employees, investors, and executives celebrating the company's success. "Every person in this room is here tonight because that company survived its first fragile years," he said calmly. "And in many ways we survived because of you." The words Alexander Grant had just spoken seemed to linger in the air long after his voice faded. For several seconds, no one at the Nearby tables said anything at all. The quiet corner of the ballroom that had gone unnoticed earlier in the evening had suddenly become the center of attention. I could feel dozens of curious eyes resting on the small space around our table as people tried to understand the unexpected connection between the company's chief executive officer and the older woman who had been sitting alone only minutes earlier. I glanced briefly toward Thomas, who now stood only a few steps away. His expression had changed completely from the confident smile he had worn while greeting colleagues earlier in the evening. There was confusion there now, and something else that looked almost like disbelief. He looked from Alexander Grant to me and then back again, as though trying to determine whether he had somehow misunderstood the entire conversation. Alexander Grant seemed to notice him standing there. The chief executive officer turned slightly and offered a polite nod of acknowledgement. "Good evening," he said warmly. "I hope I am not interrupting." Thomas cleared his throat and quickly straightened his posture. "No, not at all," he replied, his voice carrying a careful politeness. "I am Thomas Hayes." For a moment he hesitated before continuing. "Eleanor's husband." Alexander Grant's expression brightened with recognition at the introduction. "Of course," he said kindly, extending his hand. "It is a pleasure to meet you." Thomas shook his hand quickly, though his attention seemed to remain divided between the conversation and the growing audience around us. "Your wife helped shape the early direction of this company," Alexander Grant continued, speaking with calm sincerity. "I was just explaining how important her advice was during our first year." I saw Thomas blink once, clearly surprised. "I did not realize that," he admitted, glancing toward me briefly before looking back at the chief executive officer. His tone carried the polite uncertainty of someone trying to process unexpected information while standing in the middle of a crowded room. Alexander Grant smiled slightly, the way someone does when recalling a moment that still carries meaning years later. "Many people do not realize how important the right advice can be at the right moment," he said. "When we were starting out, we had enthusiasm, but very little experience with financial planning. Eleanor walked into that office and saw problems that none of us had the knowledge to recognize yet." As he spoke, I noticed several employees slowly gathering within listening distance, pretending to continue their conversations while clearly paying attention to every word. The two women at the neighboring table were leaning slightly toward us now, their earlier casual curiosity replaced by genuine fascination. Alexander Grant turned his attention back to me for a moment, his voice thoughtful. "I have tried to find you several times over the years," he explained. "When the company finally began to succeed, I wanted to thank the people who helped us survive those early days. Most of them were easy to locate. But you had moved, and the office where we met no longer existed. I remembered then that the bookstore on Franklin Street had closed not long after that afternoon meeting. Life had simply continued in different directions for everyone involved. I had never thought to look back. I did not expect to see you here tonight," he added with a gentle laugh. "But when I walked into the ballroom and saw you sitting there, I recognized you immediately." A quiet murmur spread through the nearby guests as people absorbed the story. From across the room, I could see more employees beginning to glance toward our corner, curiosity spreading through the crowd like a ripple moving across still water. Thomas shifted his weight slightly beside me, still trying to maintain a composed smile, while the unexpected attention grew stronger with each passing moment. Alexander Grant looked around the ballroom briefly and then back toward me with a thoughtful expression. "If you do not mind," he said calmly, "there are several people here tonight who should probably hear this story as well." Alexander Grant's suggestion seemed simple when he said it, yet the effect it created inside the ballroom was immediate. Several of the nearby guests straightened in their chairs, as if they already sensed something unusual was about to happen. The chief executive officer glanced briefly toward the stage where the band was still playing softly and where the large anniversary banner hung above the polished floor. Then he looked back at me with the same calm smile he had worn since recognizing me. "Would you mind walking with me for a moment?" he asked politely. For a second I hesitated, not because I felt uncomfortable, but because the sudden attention from so many strangers still felt unexpected. Yet there was nothing dramatic or demanding in his tone. It was simply an invitation offered with sincere respect. I nodded gently and stepped away from the small corner table where I had spent most of the evening sitting quietly by myself. As we began walking across the ballroom together, the change in the room became impossible to ignore. Conversations softened again, and people instinctively made space for us to pass. I could feel curious eyes following each step as the chief executive officer escorted me toward the center of the celebration. Behind us, I noticed Thomas standing still for a moment, as if deciding whether he should follow or remain where he was. After a short pause, he began walking as well, though he stayed several steps behind, his expression thoughtful and uncertain. When we reached the area near the stage, one of the event coordinators immediately approached Alexander Grant with a polite smile. "Sir, are you ready for the remarks?" she asked quietly. He nodded once, and then gestured gently in my direction. "Yes," he replied. "But first I would like to introduce someone." Within seconds the music faded and the soft murmur of the ballroom settled into a curious silence. Hundreds of guests slowly turned their attention toward the stage area, expecting the usual formal speech that often begins events like this. Instead, they saw the company's chief executive officer standing beside a woman most of them had never noticed before. Alexander Grant stepped forward and accepted the small microphone handed to him by the coordinator. His voice carried easily through the room when he began speaking. "Good evening, everyone," he said warmly. "Before we continue celebrating the 25th anniversary of this company, I would like to share a short story." A quiet ripple of interest moved through the audience. Some guests leaned slightly forward in their chairs while others exchanged curious glances. Thomas had now reached the edge of the small crowd near the stage and stood there listening with careful attention. Alexander Grant turned slightly toward me and then back toward the audience. 20 years ago, this company was not the global organization you see today, he explained. It was a small startup with 5 employees working in a rented office above a bookstore on Franklin Street. We had a promising idea, but very little experience. In truth, we were only a few bad decisions away from closing our doors. The room remained completely silent as he continued. One afternoon, a woman visited our office and reviewed our financial plan. She pointed out a mistake none of us had recognized. If we had followed our original strategy, we would have run out of operating capital within 6 months. Several employees in the audience exchanged surprised looks as the story unfolded. Alexander Grant smiled slightly and gestured toward me again. "The woman who gave us that advice is standing here tonight," he said clearly. "Her name is Eleanor Hayes." A soft wave of murmurs moved through the ballroom as hundreds of people turned to look at me more closely. I could see expressions of surprise spreading across the room, especially among those who had passed by the quiet corner table earlier without giving it a second glance. Alexander Grant waited a moment for the room to settle before continuing. "She spent less than 2 hours with our team," he said calmly. "But the advice she gave us that day changed the future of this company. Without it, we would not be celebrating this anniversary tonight." For several seconds after Alexander Grant finished speaking, the entire ballroom remained perfectly still, as if hundreds of people were quietly processing the unexpected story they had just heard. Then a ripple of applause began somewhere near the front tables. It started softly, just a few polite claps from employees who seemed unsure whether the moment called for celebration or simple acknowledgement. But within seconds the applause spread across the room like a wave rolling through a wide field. Dozens of people stood from their chairs, and the sound of their hands meeting filled the ballroom with a warm, genuine energy that I had not expected when the evening first began. I felt slightly overwhelmed by the attention and instinctively looked toward Alexander Grant, unsure how to respond to a moment that suddenly placed me in the center of a celebration that was never meant to be about me. He smiled reassuringly and gave a small nod, as if reminding me that gratitude does not require anything complicated in return. I offered a modest wave toward the audience before lowering my hand again. The applause slowly softened until the room returned to a respectful silence. Alexander Grant raised the microphone once more. "Success is often described as the result of bold ideas and strong leadership," he said calmly. "But the truth is that success usually begins with something much simpler. It begins with someone willing to offer honest advice when it matters most." His words were not dramatic, yet they carried a quiet sincerity that seemed to resonate with many people listening in the room. Several employees nodded thoughtfully, and I noticed a few younger faces watching with the kind of interest that suggested they were imagining their own futures in the company. Alexander Grant then turned toward me again and spoke in a tone that felt far more personal than the speech he had just delivered to the audience. "Eleanor, I have wanted to thank you for a very long time, he said. Tonight, I finally have that opportunity. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and removed a small envelope, the kind often used for formal invitations. Inside this envelope is something our board approved earlier this year, he explained. It is a lifetime advisory position with our company. It does not require daily work or long hours. It simply means that whenever you choose to offer guidance, we would be honored to listen. A quiet murmur of surprise moved through the crowd again. I glanced at the envelope in his hand for a moment, genuinely touched by the gesture, but also aware that the real reward had already been hearing how that brief meeting years ago had helped shape the company's path. Before I could respond, Alexander Grant added gently, "It also includes an annual honorarium, though the amount is less important than the respect behind it." I accepted the envelope with both hands and thanked him sincerely. The room responded with another warm round of applause. When the moment finally settled and the microphone was returned to the event coordinator, the music slowly began again and conversations resumed throughout the ballroom. People approached us with polite smiles, offering congratulations and curious questions about the story they had just heard. As the crowd gradually shifted back into the rhythm of the celebration, I turned slightly and saw Thomas standing only a few feet away. His expression had softened into something thoughtful, almost reflective. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The noise of the ballroom filled the space between us while he searched for the right words. Finally, he gave a small, uncertain smile and said quietly, "Eleanor, I never knew." I looked at him gently, not with anger or bitterness, but with the calm understanding that sometimes the truth about a person's worth takes time to reveal itself. I placed the envelope carefully into my handbag and replied in the same soft voice, "You never asked."